FAEbruary is underway. I can't wait to see what the muse has in store. I always love this first moment. You've got this blank page. This is full of possibilities. And I'm almost seeing where the first stroke is going to be. And this is going to turn into a fairy. Here we are in FAEbruary, and hello everyone, welcome back to the Solmanac, and we are on the, I believe, technically third day, because I've done two fairies. Tonight's prompt is the Algaric Mushroom, the iconic red and white capped mushroom that you find randomly floating in the woods, and I'm going to be doing an elf. The prompt is Algaric elf. And so we will see what comes of it. I'm excited. You never know what's going to happen. And I'm sure at some point there's a story. We'll see how that goes. I mean, the main goal is to just get these paintings done, vlog about them, and perhaps a story comes out of it. We'll see. I had a wonderful story come out yesterday, just stream of consciousness, which was just wonderful. But it's been raining all day. I've just been so happy and enjoying it. And I've been in here creating. And it's been wonderful enjoying this work, this art. I can't wait to... It's been raining all day. Great day to make art and everything. So I'm not going to take much more time. Let's get into it. FAEbruary is underway. I can't wait to see what the muse has in store. And I have made a couple batches of coffee. I have the one from last time. This one is very dark, but I wanted to do maybe a mid-tone. So this one is maybe half the coffee, I think almost twice the water. So we'll see what that gets us. Who knows? Maybe the next one I make yet another shade. But yeah, so let's search for some fairies. All right. Welcome back to FAEbruary. This was technically the third piece that I made. And I'm still making sure to just have fun and go a little more ambitious, but not as crazy as I've gone in the past. Because it's a lot to kind of keep these vlogs going, and a great many of them tend to be a creative endeavor where I'm making something and then documenting it. So the previous one was a sketch, and it was an ink sketch with just a little bit of coffee. And this one I worked much more with coffee stains. Of course, I start with this sketch here, so I got to really play around with this guy. This prompt was the Algaric elf. So of course that's based on the iconic, probably the most visually iconic of all mushrooms, the Algaric mushroom, which is known for its bright red cap, and it has lots of white spots on it. And the stem can be thick, and the cap can be kind of almost dome-like, rather than, like flat and wide. It can vary. You've certainly seen it before. And then it's got this slight skirt underneath it. But it's probably been most famous of all things Super Mario Brothers. That's that mushroom that Mario eats. And this was really fun, just kind of getting into the dipping fountain pen once the sketching was finished. And there was this moment when I removed the masking tape that it took a lot of the surface of the paper with it, which just pretty much every time I remove the masking tape on my borders, it does that. And it's never really a big deal. But this time, as you can see, the paper is not white. The surface is treated to be this color, which is a beautiful color to work with, and it's beautiful paper. But when I took the masking tape off, it really just ripped off the surface. And I had all these huge swaths of just like ripped white. It was pretty noticeable, but it was also very interesting. I'm kind of getting ahead of it, but because you'll see what I mean. But also, it led to some other really interesting things that I had never tried before, which is always pretty fun about working with art. Um, you know, if you can be multidisciplinary and work with different mediums, one of my favorite things to do is when I feel myself getting maybe a little too good at a medium, and I don't mean in like a self-sabotaging way. There's a part of me that wants to challenge myself again or try something else. It seems to whisper, if you go work on something else, you're going to be able to come back to this with total wonder and you'll reinvent it. And which always happens throughout my life. There's times where I try to ignore that and there's this stagnating feeling. I think you know what I mean. When you just kind of stay with something too long. So I can't recommend it enough to just play and dig down and see what you're made of, because it is very refreshing when you take something you don't know as well and there's this feeling like you're starting over and there's a slight identity crisis. It's slight, it's just like when you take up any new thing. But the beautiful thing is what happens when later I come back to the previous medium and I see where all that work in the new one, finding myself or a new part of myself really went. And I'm able to approach this other medium that I know very well to the point of getting bored. And now it is really showing me some new things. I recommend that for everybody. I think we're also in a world now. I think about this constantly. This is one of the things that just occupies my mind. I think for the last 5 years or so. I say this a lot, and I should just, this is just another one of those thoughts I need to just like be out with it here, which is the world we're in now, in my opinion, or in my theory, is very different from the world of 2019, or I should say the world of 2020 in February before the world changed. I think I did this really revolutionary February run of coffee stained fairies. And that year, after that was done, we're in March, and then the world just changed. And, we suddenly had all these crazy rumblings of news, and then next thing you know, people are dying from this strange thing called C-19, and we're all like, wow, what is that? What's going on? People are saying crazy stuff, respiratory, it's airborne. And then I remember 2 people were found dead in California, my state. I think that was in early March or something. So now it was stateside, and everyone just lost their stuff. And that was kind of it. After that, everything was just different. And we all went remote. We went into lockdown. Nothing was what we remembered. Nothing was as it seemed before. And nothing has ever been the same since. Now, that could change in a certain way. Anything's possible, but at the same time, I feel, and I've said this to, many friends or family, that I feel no matter what happened to any of us, to me, there was a lesson to be gleaned from 2020. And you might find this way too spiritual, or maybe it's just what you needed to hear, but I firmly believe, and I had many very memorable phone conversations in that time, as I'm sure we all did. We're mammals, we're pack animals, we need to be together, we're social animals. And I remember this one conversation, and I just realized that this was a huge apocalypse for me. Matter of fact, one time I saw the definition of an apocalypse, and it said an economic calamity. So that's literally what we all went through. But I went through my own apocalypse during that. I was out constantly doing different jobs, and that was when I started looking into taking my art online, selling prints, digital marketing with it. And that was something I always thought maybe I would do one day. Now all of a sudden I had all this time, and I had the unemployment money, and I just dove into research, took a course, and I started doing all kinds of new things. Like I'd do Facebook Lives where I was doing digital art shows, sharing my art in these Facebook Lives. And it was all very new and exciting and freaky and, total imposter syndrome all the time. But I think that I look back on it and I think I was right to look at it that way and to approach it that way. That this was the end of the world as it was previously known. And that's the way it was for everyone. And I still see people, and I'm guilty of this too, but I see people that now, we're 5 years later, and it's a very human thing to just not want to go back there. It's also very human to act as though it never happened. Which, free country, free world, but it did happen. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen, and I don't want it to happen again, but it was I found it to be a terrifying time. Personally, I was never scared of that virus. I was more observing the different rights that were being taken away. Lockdown was a ridiculous measure in my opinion, and I stand by that. And it's pretty easy at this point to just research that and find things to support that that was a little excessive. And here we are years later, and you're really not allowed to talk about it, which is really strange. I think in like one side is allowed to talk about it, but the other side is not. And I think that's really weird too. I mean, that totally changed where we were at. And I say all this as a probably the grandest example of the art that I am doing, where I'm always pushing these mediums and keeping myself on my toes, challenging myself. And I would say that I really stepped into that. I've always been that way throughout my life, whether it was with art or acting or types of acting, a certain acting role or a certain acting class or art class. It was always, am I scared to do this? Okay, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do that one because I'm scared to take that road. And perhaps that made me uniquely placed to really experience the world the way I did 5 years ago. But there is a little constant feeling of validation and accomplishment of that side of myself every time I'm taking up like some new piece of art or doing a new medium. Like this year is the first time I'm doing these coffee stains on this kind of, I think it's cold pressed. I think the other day I had said this was I think the other day I said I was used to working on cold press, but I believe it's hot press that I'm used to, the really smooth type of paper. Whereas this one is a little more toothy and absorbs the coffee more, which I would say is actually the true cold pressed, if I'm not mistaken. But this is a technique that I've done many times. I've even got some how-to videos of painting with coffee. But this paper is very different in terms of its reaction. There's a slight bleed that it does with all the little puddles of coffee that I'm just dippling onto here with, this almost larger pointillism type of technique. And there's something very just calming about all this that I just really enjoy. So I'm building up everything here. And the intention is that once this dries, I will put another layer of these dots, kind of filling in the spaces between those dots in some ways. Though with this one, I'm essentially just going to cover the cap. I was feeling that as it's going, because it's going to have the white spots on it, this really needs to be a little more of a solid cap there. But, I'm pretty much just filling the real estate with all these drops. Again, I find it very meditative. And what's better than meditating with art and coffee stains? So as you can see, this is what I'm talking about. And you see that white strip there on the side? I was going to just cover that up and treat it, but then I just thought, this is really interesting. Do I like it? I feel like it just kind of illustrates the gold parchment even more. So I pretty much kept it for this whole video, but towards the end, I'm going to do something with it. And there's kind of a feeling of Arthur Rackham here. You can look up Arthur Rackham. He's one of the greatest fairy tale illustrators ever. I think he was late 19th to early 20th century. So what I was saying, where I'm like bringing more of the little puddles and putting them kind of between the spaces of the previous layer. So it starts to build up a little more. And that fly Algaric, which again, you've probably seen, it's got a pretty rich history. I mean, I think one of the oldest instances is actually like way out in Siberia, and you had shamans there, and they would use it, of course, for its more psychoactive and spiritual rituals, like, kind of psychoactive type properties. And there's even some theories that link it to Santa Claus because the mushroom's red and white, and it's also got a historical significance being used during the solstice celebrations. So, Christmas, the rituals and timing come out of the solstice, the winter solstice in the pagan traditions. So people are saying, well, it might not be a far cry from that. Though, if I'm not mistaken, I think that is one of the more well-known advertising stories in the realm of advertising, where Coca-Cola actually kind of hijacked the costuming of Santa Claus and they went with red and white, and those are their colors. But it could also, have its roots in Siberia. The fly Algaric is also, it's also got some toxicity to it. But it's rare that people die, so that's a good thing. But still, don't go, trying it out without some serious supervision, because you can get really sick or nauseous and vomit and all that fun stuff. I think at its worst, it can cause serious seizures. So, don't do that. And you might be wondering where the name fly Algaric is, and that actually comes from its use as a fly killer. So what they do is they would take the mushroom and they would process it and put it in milk, and it would attract the flies, and they basically die from it. So it had a poison, or something that flies would consider poison. And it's also, I believe, featured in Alice in Wonderland. And it is, I don't know if it's like mentioned as the mushroom that she eats, but you can't have Alice in Wonderland without the fly Algaric mushroom. I mean, it's just, the two are synonymous with each other now, I think. And just when you see one in the woods, and when I see them, it's just amazing how they just announce themselves. They're whimsical, they're cute. There's also something slightly creepy sometimes. I mean, there's a lot of redwood forest where I live, and you have a lot of that dark earth because the redwood leaves and the bark, just as they fall to the ground, they have this reddish dark hue to them. So you get a nice little fly Algaric mushroom sprouting out of that with its bright red cap and all the white spots, and it just looks out of place. It doesn't even look like it's part of this world. There's something fantastic about it. So it's perfect to be in Wonderland, which is where logic goes to die. So now I'm adding another layer here. One of the things I really enjoy with coffee stains is when I put all these little puddles and I let them kind of dry, sometimes I can maybe wait till they're almost dry and then take the brush and just start moving the paint around. But this is kind of what I'm doing here, is kind of a way of controlling the patterns on the cap of the mushroom. And I don't really have it here, but one of the things you can do is just get like another like you can either get a deeper shade of coffee or you can get a lighter shade of coffee and just enjoy, go crazy. You kind of make gradations because you are doing like a monochrome project here. It's just not black and white. It's like a golden to brown gradation, which I think just comes out beautifully. And these leaves were fun. I just enjoy all things fall. It is I think it's a real gift to play in a way that makes you keep having new eyes. And speaking of that, this was a totally new thing where I was essentially playing with masking tape. So as you can see on the right side of the page, there's all that white that was ripped off. So I thought, well, I want there to be more white in the middle of the page between my elf and the mushroom. And this paper was dyed yellow. And I thought, well, what if I was to find some of that white underneath, just like I did on the edge? And it took some doing. I mean, I just started taping this everywhere. And it was kind of a challenge, but it was also really fun to just do something new. I love this guy's hat, but I love hats. But there was something about, I think, doing this piece that I wanted to, I think, just respect what I grew up thinking elves are or what they do, but also learning the folklore. And I felt like it was a lot of fun to do. It was like I had my own world. It's kind of interesting because I've been writing a story for this, and I wrote that it takes place in a pine forest. Just picking pine because, that's where I'm from. I'm used to pine and redwoods. And then I looked it up, and it says actually the fly Algaric is found in forests of, I think it's birch and pine. And it was cool. I love when those things happen. And I've got this guy with his knitting needles. So he's getting some work done. I can kind of relate, It's nice to just find your own things to do, especially right now when the world is always uncertain. You don't have to be uncertain. I'll just say that. You can find the things you love to do and just focus on those. I think Robert Kiyosaki has said, the world belongs to those who go digital and do meaningful work. And I think that since 2020 and now, I've always just been honing in on that. How can I do meaningful work, and what's a way that I can do it digitally? And I think that anything that puts you in a thought experiment like that is not a bad thing. I think you're bound to get some great feedback from yourself or your life. And now I've got the smaller brush, and I'm just going even more lighter, a little more detailed, because this is one of the great things about doing these challenges, whether it's Mermay or FAEbruary or Inktober or Drawloween or Nymphember. I think that each time, if you really commit to them, they're going to teach you new techniques. They're going to teach you what's so great about the techniques you learned. And with this one, I was really just kind of going more conservatively. I didn't want to just put a whole bunch of coffee puddles, because sometimes you can just get way too into putting the darkest coffee too soon, which in some ways I felt like I was doing this a little backwards, but I do think that it was great for what it was, and I didn't need to just like beat myself up on, is this really good to be here? And I think if you play your cards right, like with anything, but painting and with ink, that can really be a chess move. Like you can't necessarily go backwards. So you have to really know what it is you're going after. But I really enjoyed as I was getting into my character here, with the knitting needles, making something, being creative. And here I was just starting to play and carve out shadows and light. I wonder if you have any hobbies. Do you knit? Do you crochet? Do you sew? I mean, many of you do all those things. I know you do, but would love to hear what you think of them. And I love that. Like the way the cap is going. It's getting this nice, almost chocolatey look to it. I decided I wasn't going to do red on this one. I did it for the Holly King, and I figured that, hey, I think what would be great is if I just make this thing all brown except, maybe a little white for highlights. But it was really fun to explore nuances with this. Sometimes I'm using the dipping fountain pen to just flesh out everything in terms of outlines, but I didn't really do too much shading with it, which was kind of a risk for me. Usually when I'm getting into the inking, I will kind of indulge in a bit of shading, and sometimes I feel like maybe I've done too much of it. What I'm looking to do more and more, I say that now, and I'll probably do something opposite on my next piece, but what I'm trying to do more and more is just really go with the outlines and trust that the paint is going to give me the best results of shading, because it's very easy to overdo it with ink. So this is a really compelling new technique I started playing with on this right here in real time. I'm trying this thing out. I don't know how it's going to go. But I'm taking that masking tape and I'm putting it all over this mushroom in what I intend to be, I'd say, the lightest parts of the piece. And if you've worked with watercolor, then you know that any negative space is going to be gold in terms of the lightest values. And if you do it right, they'll be so light that they're just going to make the darkest values in the piece really pop. So as you can see, it didn't quite do too much on the cap of the mushroom. There's that one little bit of negative ripped up space on the left. Now here, where my pieces were bigger, so they had more glue on them, and I really kind of rubbed them in a little so that they would really bond to the paper. And so when I pull it off, it really brings that surface layer out, and you've got all this negative space now. And when I was saying that the more untouched paper you have in a watercolor, that's going to be like gold, because you can use white paint or white watercolor. It's not going to be the same. You're going to get gray or something like that. But what was cool about this technique is now I have definitely a real value happening, a contrast between light and shadow. It was kind of harrowing because, again, I'm new with this paper. I'm not used to this paper, so I don't know how much of this paper is going to go, but on this part, it's really taking that paper with it. And I am not used to mutilating paper that is right in the center of the painting. So you can see I'm like, oh boy, what's happening? I mean, it was like starting to take pieces of the painting, which is not what I wanted. But it wasn't too much. I have to say it was pretty well controlled. And yeah, so this is kind of giving me a sense of light more. But there's going to be more stuff that comes into play, because now I can kind of see more of what I'm working with. But I have to say, it was pretty exciting. I think there's always something a little different that happens with FAEbruary. I think with Mermet, I'm just getting sometimes a little more complicated. You know, I'm going from novice to intermediate and so on with my technique of using the colors. But I feel like if you work with coffee, one of the things that's happening is, I mean, it's unlike any other medium. It's not like watercolors. And you're pretty much working with one color, so you're working with gradations of light and shadow. And that's pretty much all you get. And I think what I've settled on is a style that is maybe like a very light version of Arthur Rackham, where I'm not getting as into the pen techniques as Arthur Rackham does, but I'm using them to define it. What ink does is it gives you 3D. I can't tell you how many times throughout my life, whether I was, 2 weeks ago or it was 20 years ago, I have always loved when maybe I have a pencil sketch and it's an under sketch. In other words, it's going to have paint on it. It's going to have ink on it. And I would be so proud of the kind of visible war that I could see with the pencil. And then I would add ink. And I'd feel kind of bad because I felt like the ink was so dark. And now I was going to flesh it out and make it look finished. And I would be erasing that pencil underneath because my pencil sketches were really detailed. I don't know if that was the best idea. I think since then I've moved more into less detailed sketches so that it really makes me work on the ink more. But it's still kind of scary when I'm adding that ink, and it just always looks like, the pencil has gotten all these beautiful gradations on it, and then you add this one ink outline to it, and the pencil seems to just like fall away. It's like just not as powerful, but that I think is a strength of ink as an outlining tool, because it's just going to make your images in choice places that you decide. It's going to make them pop. And I think when that happens, it just really assists you And now I'm just kind of layering the darkness on this because now that I have that white, I've kind of got data of what I need to do. So I don't know if you can see this, but as I was talking, I was really darkening the cap of that mushroom. And so that's bringing out those light layers much more. They complete each other. And that's just a beautiful thing. I'm always working with light and shadow on Ghost in the Gaslight, and it's so gratifying, especially if I'm doing a black and white piece, if it's watercolor ink or if it's drawing with ink. I love that point where I can build up the shadows and then the light that I have. Generally these days I plan it pretty well. I'm really into the planning stage of it, but the way it's all situated, the white really starts to come into its own and really tell a story along with the shadows. It's a dance, and it's a beautiful one. I think one of the other things that I learn every year with coffee is that it's in many ways the simplest of all the mediums that I do. Technically, I'd say probably sketching with pencil is the simplest, but you can control so much with pencil, and that makes it not simple. I can go very detailed with it. But with coffee, I've got to be very creative with my details. And in this one, I'm really, like I said before, I'm working on the outlines with the pen. Like, that's pretty much all the pen was relegated to on this. It's the coffee that I'm relying on, and I'm relying on my experience and my ability with coffee to bring up the values of this and tell the story visually of it. And I have to be mindful and creative. I got to kind of plan out where I'm going with it to just see if I can unlock the possibilities. And it's not easy. Some of them are easy. But I think there's some times where I really want to just tell like a very impressive story visually with it. Not necessarily just to like impress people, but to prove to myself that I can do this, that, or the other thing. And it's a war. Sometimes I got my tail between my legs, and that piece really messed me up. I get it together towards the end of the piece, and maybe I find some way to bring it home, but the painting and I both know that it kicked my ass. And that is tough. But almost like clockwork, the next day I go, you know what? I'm just going to go simple. And it goes very well, and I really see the payoff of the previous struggle. And I feel like that happens so much with coffee. And this is called the skirt of the fly Algaric. And I was just kind of experimenting on this. Again, with this new paper that seems to absorb the coffee very well. How detailed can I go? I took one of my smallest or my thinnest brushes and just gave some texture to that skirt there. And now we get to play with highlights. This was a little leap that I took last year where I made these very detailed pieces for FAEbruary. I mean, I only did 3 the whole month. But I think one of the big payoffs with it was that I started experimenting with white paint. I'm pretty sure I did gouache. It might have been a little acrylic, but I'm pretty sure it was all gouache. What's interesting with gouache and coffee, both of them rehydrate when you add moisture or water. So there was this feeling like This way I wouldn't get too crazy with the layering, because I just felt like I was slightly giving up at the time with gouache. I'd done, I think 5 years by then of coffee stains and assistance from drawing, but there was a purist in me that wanted to just see how I can find it with the paint. But when it came to the cap of this mushroom, I was not interested in leaving a little negative space for every dot on this mushroom cap. That was just going to be too much. And I studied a lot of the caps, the way the light hits them, and I felt like it would be so neat and unreal if I could kind of capture that with coffee and then have another type of paint sitting on the cap, and then it would look like those beautiful like white raised bumps that are on the cap. I mean, raised bumps, it's like redundant word. But I feel like it would just kind of mimic the wonder of a fly Algaric cap. So you can see, I mean, I just love that cap. I feel like I could just pick it off the stem there and I could just break it in two. Like, I just love the way the textures coming together there. I had all these theories, and it is always gratifying to see them kind of coming to fruition. And I love that under that cap, it's making this light, which was my concept, but the light is from masking tape ripping off the surface of the coffee and the surface of the paper. And I feel like it's really giving me a sense of where it's going. I'm going to go in there and just kind of work on that. But I just thought that was so inspiring, or inspired. And I'm just kind of making sure that these dry more on the white side. So some of them need a double layer. One of the things with the white on a dark color, the white gouache, is that when it dries, it's not as like white. It can almost go into a gray. So I think it behooves you to go over it with a second or third layer if you want it to be white. That's one of the things with gouache, is the lights don't dry as light as they were when you painted them, and the darks don't dry as dark as they were when you painted them. But all in all, I'm really liking where this is going. And there's a line in the movie Chariots of Fire where Eric Liddell, who's one of the gold medalists, and he's kind of the natural talent, but he's talking to the media, and it's, I think, in the 30s or something, when England just won like a crazy amount of gold medals for their runners. But Eric Liddell says, I want to compare faith with running in a race. And the same is true for me. I want to compare faith with experimenting on a painting or a drawing with a new medium and seeing where it's going to take you. There are so many times you just fail at it, but if you really believe in what you're doing and you really hone in on the story you're telling, it does tend to inform what is next, as long as you don't do anything crazy. So you can see one thing that's happening that's really wonderful here is that negative space I created by ripping the tape off. Now when I add white to kind of clean it up a bit, it's not going to look weird and bluish and gray because it's on top of the coffee. I'm adding gouache white to it. And the revealed surface of the paper beneath it is going to really make that white pop much more. I don't know if you can see it right now, but it's almost taking on a slight glowing quality. So I was very proud that I stumbled onto that. Because one thing I was struggling with, and you know, if you're looking for it now that I say it in the Holly King, you will find that there is a lot of that kind of grayish, bluish white. But with this one, I was really learning the kind of nuances of what I can do in terms of being as little as possible. Like, what could I do that would still get people excited, but that I could still I guess, hang my hat on as a way to further the piece. One of the things that I love about this kind of paper, that, you know, that's this color, or the paper that's in my art journal, which is very similar to this, is when you get it and it is a golden paper or like a slight peach colored paper. In other words, like the color of flesh, you know? So that color that makes up most of the paper is being done for you. And one of the things that artists are known for doing is figure drawing or drawing a face. These are things that we've been doing since time immemorial, and I would like to think keeps happening. So one of the great things about using these kind of off-white type papers, if it's cream or tan or beige or gold, is now you can devote a much smaller portion to the highlights. And that makes much more sense. I think that is closer to what life drawing should be. You're imitating nature. But there is something satisfying as you work on all this, and you know, you've gotten all the shadows, you've gotten the gradations of shadows, you're getting them to the midpoint, you know, the regular color of the paper, which in this case, because it's not white paper, is the middle of the lighting. So now the highlights are just going to be occasional, a little more eventful, and they're going to be like just little accents and touches, which is really fun. You've really just done your work, and you know you've done your work when you start to see light being carved out. I'm not quite there yet, but it will come around. But see, you know, I just put that in there and boom, you can feel how far the light goes, how it's touching him. But you'll notice, like with my brush movements, like I'm just kind of lingering, slight hesitation, because at this point I'm like, you know, kind of squinting my eyes and looking at what's happening. The lamp on the light on it is a little much. Now, what I'm doing is I'm adding just a little more dark color with gouache. I'm just doing some kind of choice elements where I want it to be darker. And just like I did some choice moments where the light is, the shadow on there, the dark parts, the cap of the mushroom, the foot of the stump or the stem, it just makes everything pop more. And so I have this elf, this fly Algaric elf, who has just sat down on his haunches and he is knitting by the light of the fly Algaric mushroom. And thank you for taking this little journey with me. The story will be coming soon. Take care. There we go. One thing I'd like to add, there's a little bit of this slightly off yellow paint. I painted over the parts where it got ripped. I wanted to just give it just a little more of a complete feel. But this was a fun little project. I got to just kind of experiment further with this new pretty paper and just learn a little more about coffee stains and all of that. And I really enjoy adding a little gouache towards the end with the coffee. And this was a fun little trip. Thanks for taking it with me. Mushrooms trip, anyone? And I am looking forward to what the next one has in store for us. FAEbruary is an adventure. And so is this vlogging. This is a very special year that I feel like I have you with me in this. Sometimes it's just a war, figuring out the coffee and the fairies and the narrative and working out the light and all of that. And it is kind of nice to be sharing all of this with you. So on that note, be sure to like and subscribe, leave me a comment. I would love to know your thoughts. And also, there's the Substack. If you'd like to hear more stories, don't forget, follow me on Substack. Love your support. Thanks for the feedback you send me on the stories, whether you send it by email or you leave a comment on there. It's just been a lot of fun. Speaking of email, there's the Inbox of Curiosities, which gets you plugged into all things happening with Ghost in the Gaslight. If you like ghost stories, if you like creativity, I'm sure you're going to find something fun and of value all the time. All right, well, I'm Saul. This is Ghost in the Gaslight. This is where the happily haunted are. Take care, you beautiful haunted romantics.